Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our global panelists and our audience. On behalf of the Transatlantic Leadership Network, Executive Vice President Sasha Toporich and myself, welcome to our next in a series of webinars on energy and climate. I'm Deborah Kagan, Distinguished Energy Fellow, and will be your host and moderator for today's panel. TLN has a comprehensive energy program that is continuously developing and growing. Our focus has generally been on the Mediterranean region, and this webinar is part of our Track 2 project, Mediterranean Markets 2030 and Beyond, a series of events that will culminate in London in May of next year with an in-person 2-day conference intended to make further progress in green and blue energy and development, strategy and development. Following COP26, everyone, including us, has an important role and mission to play. But energy, as we know, has no borders, and there are international participants that can make or break the ability of other countries to implement greener policies. As such, TLN will be incorporating viewpoints from other continents and regions as we go forward. And today is an example of how we are broadening this conversation. So COP26 has had a significant buildup and a great deal of promise that nations will come together and at least agree on a way forward that would put our planet on the right path to a better climate future. But there is always a gap between what will be implemented and what is just aspirational. And there were many promises made at Glasgow and an equal lack of promises on some critical issues. So all of us are curious about what this means for the immediate and not too distant future. Sometimes that's hard to decipher. So breaking this down for us today and analyzing what this final document does and does not mean, and is our first speaker, our senior fellow ambassador, John Craig. In addition to his distinguished diplomatic career, including the United States ambassador to Oman, Ambassador Craig is currently the ambassador at residence at the Center for Global Understanding and Peacemaking at Elizabethtown College in Elizabethtown, Pennsylvania. And as if this were not impressive enough, Ambassador Craig is the American member, the sole American member of the eminent Scotia Group, which served as advisors for global leaders, both in preparation for COP26 and what's next. Ambassador Craig, the floor is yours. John?
I'm sorry. Thank you, Deborah, and welcome to our other panelists. The Transatlantic Leadership Network has been focusing on the energy situation in the Eastern Mediterranean for the past 18 months. That focus is based on the importance of developing new sources of energy to support the need for faster and more robust economic growth in the countries of the region, and particularly in Cyprus, Israel, Jordan, Egypt, and Libya. Promising new offshore discoveries in the region's waters have given rise to the rapid development of gas reserves in Israel and Egypt. Political issues are preventing the development of other known reserves as more aggressive states of the region try to take greater and greater control of these important hydrocarbon resources. Those issues will be looked at more carefully by the following panelists. At the same time, the Transatlantic Leadership Network has been supporting in a major way the efforts of a unique private sector group of climate control scientists and experts who have been working to help make the just concluded Glasgow Climate Summit, also known as COP26, a success in terms of impacting and lowering the rate of global warming to the Paris Accord level of not more than 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit by 2030. This group, called the Scotia Group, is not connected with any government or industry. The group was formed to put a spotlight on the dire situation facing the world because of the continuing increase in carbon emissions. This increase is the result mainly of the generation of needed electric power by burning coal and natural gas. The Scotia Group approached the Glasgow Summit by first declaring a state of diplomatic emergency. It is clear that the goal of reducing carbon emissions by 2030 is no longer possible. In fact, the actual level of carbon emissions has risen by 85% of the total emissions described in the 2013 Paris Climate Conference. The Scotia Group also created workable solutions and transmitted them to the parties at the Glasgow Summit, as well as to the participants of the G20 Summit in Rome, which took place just 2 days before the Glasgow event. In order to understand the nature of the emergency, one must review the actions of the international community since the first identification of the seriousness of the problem of global warming in 1995. In spite of numerous international fora sponsored by the United Nations, and in spite of repeated commitments by the governments, there is no record of any action taken by any national state actor to implement commitments to reduce carbon emissions. As a result of this inaction, the projection is that the world's average temperature will rise between 3 and 4 degrees Fahrenheit by 2030 and not decline by 1.5 degrees Fahrenheit, as is needed to stop increasing damage and loss due to the negative climate changes. The reduction in global warming can be achieved in only one way, that is to reduce carbon emissions to zero. In order to achieve this, which again, of course, is absolutely necessary, the world must stop and then eliminate the production of electricity by coal and natural gas. Unfortunately, the demand for electricity continually increases because it's a critical element to both promotion and acceleration of economic growth. Reduction of carbon emissions to zero will require the use of alternate energies to generate electricity. Currently, the sources are not efficient enough to replace fossil fuels. Substantial investment in research and development of alternate sources is needed. Of course, the countries who need to replace fossil fuels are those who do not have the financial resources to undertake such research and development. One critical alternative source of power generation is, at the present time, not even being discussed. Nuclear power generation holds a comprehensive answer to the carbon emissions problem, but the nuclear technology is not even discussed because of fears about the safety of this technology. With a dismal record of implementing previous commitments and the growing emergency, which is the result of lack of effective action since 1995, the hope was that the Glasgow Summit might result in a different outcome, one of more serious and more difficult actions to reduce and eliminate carbon emissions. We've got to say that the Glasgow Summit succeeded in at least increasing the knowledge about the seriousness of the effects of continued global warming. The national delegations representing all members of the United Nations adopted a common communique which continues to recognize the need for urgent action, but which still leaves those actions up to national authorities and does not contain any enforcement or monitoring mechanisms. The fundamental issue at the moment is how to help China and India move away from coal. That requires at least a three-way deal with the United States and probably also needs to conclude the EU. These negotiations will be time-consuming. The change is also likely to result, the pledges made at the end of the summit regarding the reduction in polluting cars by 2035 also needs to bring in a wider group of participants, namely the Volkswagen company and Japanese manufacturers. This change is likely to result in a drop in the oil price, perhaps as low as $25 a barrel by the early 2030s. Oil producers will be sidelined. That leaves the politics of natural gas, which are already heating up with threats from Ukraine and Putin towards Europe. Those issues bring us back to the energy issues of the Mediterranean. While short-term countries in the short term, countries in the region will benefit from the availability and use of natural gas. In the longer term, those same countries must be thinking about alternative sources of power. The economic elements of this problem are simple enough, but the political realities are much more complicated. Thank you, Deborah, for the opportunity to tell you about the work of the Scotia Group.
Thanks so much, Ambassador Craig. I really appreciate that. And I think the one takeaway, key takeaway I have of this, and we'll get into this in our discussion later, is implementation and enforcement, because there is no such mechanism. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but I think that's a critical point about who's going to hold whose feet to the fire. And so with that, I want to go to our next speaker, which is I noted earlier, issues about climate change go well beyond borders, but some countries are not equally committed to others and have ulterior motives, which are decidedly old-fashioned, have less to do with climate and more to do with wielding energy as an ultimate weapon. Today, Russia is considered the largest methane leaker in the world, both upstream in production and downstream through its gas pipelines, which are sieves, as we've seen in Europe and elsewhere. So we want to know what may have occurred in Scotland that might change Russia. Is there anything that's going to change Russia's careless practices on this 100 countries who signed this methane leakage promise here? So today we're fortunate to have one of the foremost thinkers on Russian energy and its impact both on climate and as soft power on the European Union, Eastern Europe, and other parts of the world. Margarita Asanova is a senior fellow at the Jamestown Foundation, where she is an expert on political and energy security developments in Russia, the Balkans, and Central Asia. She's a recipient of the John Knight Professional Journalism Fellowship at Stanford University for her excellent reporting on nationalism in the Balkans. Very, very good topic, not our topic today, but a good one these days. And has authored numerous books and journal articles on security, energy, and democracy. Ms. Asanova, over to you. Please unmute.
Sorry about that. Thank you for inviting me to this excellent forum today, very timely, to assess what happened in Glasgow and what is the road ahead. Also, thank you for this generous introduction. So what we witnessed in Glasgow is a continuation of Russian behavior on the European energy market. Russian President Putin did not attend the summit, neither did the Chinese president. And although Russia is the largest polluter of methane gas emissions in the world, it actually is responsible for almost 20% of all methane gas emissions globally. It did not really take the pledge for reduction of those emissions. Neither did China, or Iran. Iran is actually the third largest polluter after the United States. So we have Russia, United States, and then comes Iran. And the United States is trying to do what's necessary to reduce those emissions. Russia is absent from the scene. It's not an isolated event. It is absolutely connected to Russia's behavior. And I want to allude here a little bit to the energy crisis that we are still witnessing in Europe. While the world leaders gathered in Glasgow to pledge to reducing greenhouse emissions and launch the global methane pledge, Russian President Vladimir Putin was busy blackmailing Europe by reducing natural gas deliveries. He staged the so-called Italian strike, doing the minimum on contracts, delivering the minimum that's necessary on contracts, but undermining the entire gas security system in Europe by keeping the storage facilities controlled by Gazprom empty. This is going to create problems if we have a cold spell later this winter. What is the purpose of such behavior? It's very clear: to press Germany and the European Union to certify Nord Stream 2 natural gas pipeline, to force the European member states to return to strict long-term contracts under conditions dictated by Gazprom. And these contracts for the Central and Eastern European countries would not be preferential as the contracts that Gazprom has with Germany. And also the third purpose is to submit the European Union to changing its energy legislation and make it satisfactory to its dominant supplier, Russia. By building 2 mega pipelines in the last decade, the Nord Stream corridor, Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, with a combined capacity of 110 BCM of natural gas, and Turk Stream with a capacity of 33 BCM of natural gas, Russia is preparing to play a major role in Europe's energy transition while achieving other geopolitical goals. And these goals are pretty clear: bypass Ukraine, squeeze Central and Eastern Europe in a pincer-like movement of pipelines to prevent access to alternative gas supplies, sabotage regional gas market development, and also kill the competition as much as possible, prevent the competition from reaching those markets. But in the midst of Russia's gas supply blackmail in Europe and rising energy prices globally, President Biden called on Russia and Saudi Arabia to start producing more oil, so the prices go down. The American prices also went up as a result of the global energy demand increase. Although he recognized the irony of this statement, the truth is the world will have to decide which are going to be the base energy sources for a successful transition. Europe has to decide as well. Germany has betted on gas, mostly Russian gas. The other possible base energy source is the nuclear power. Germany is staying away, closing down all its energy plants by the end of next year. But the more dependent Europe becomes on Russian gas, the further away it will be drifting from its climate goals. This is the problem with the methane emissions that are 80 times more potent as polluters and providing greenhouse gas emissions to the atmosphere than the other sources. As I mentioned, Russia is responsible for almost 20% of global methane gas emission. And in Glasgow, more than 100 countries worldwide pledged to join to cut the global methane emissions from human activity by 30% in the next 9 years. Russia and China were not among them. The estimates of International Energy Agency are showing that if the world achieves only 30% cut in methane emissions from human activity by 2030, it would have a similar impact on global warming as switching all the world's cars, trucks, ships, and planes, the entire global transport sector, over the net zero emissions and technologies. But we're facing here a behavior of Russian leadership that is not conducive to making such a change in Russia. Although, frankly, Russia is one of the most threatened countries by global warming, particularly Arctic Siberia, which by assessment of different analysts is much more susceptible, much more endangered than other parts of the Arctic. Somehow the climate change is affecting Arctic Siberia more severely. If the permafrost starts melting, this is going to undermine the infrastructure built on that frosted ground at the moment. It will become unstable. The pipelines would become unstable. The gas producing facilities are going to become unstable. This could lead to real catastrophe, not only for Russia, but for the world. And although Russia is making news now and kind of boasting about the opening of the Arctic route for trade, the incoming catastrophe, the pending catastrophe is so severe that unless the Russian leadership in the Kremlin starts taking measures and start addressing the problem, nothing is going to change. Europe, on the other hand, unfortunately, is becoming more dependent on Russian gas than ever, not only by quantities, because the numbers that we see now, they're a little smaller into 2020 than they were in previous years, but that's going to grow. And especially if Germany closes every single reactor, these numbers are going to certainly grow. But also, this is dirty gas, one, because it pollutes the atmosphere with methane, and it's dirty gas because it's corrupting the entire economic infrastructure and political class in many European countries. And I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Margarita. I appreciate it. I want to give Ambassador Craig, before we go any further, because he does have to leave in a couple of minutes. Do you have any comments to make on what has been said here? John, please unmute. Thank you.
Deborah, Deborah, thank you very much. The focus of the Glasgow summit was to try not only to obtain commitments on the reduction of carbon emissions, but also to try to develop some sort of mechanism to monitor and hold countries accountable who don't live up to their commitments. And so, I mean, the dangers are real. There's no question that if the current emissions continue, and I'm glad that Margarita pointed out the dangers of methane as well. I mean, methane is also, even though natural gas may be an alternative to coal, methane is a really dangerous polluter. So the whole question of how we're doing and how we approach countries that don't monitor or enforce their commitments is extremely important. And the other issue that Margarita mentioned, which is so important, is damage and loss. One of the issues at the Glasgow summit was the concept of establishing some sort of fund that would be used to compensate countries for damage and loss. Well, of course, this was immediately rejected because the countries to be compensated are not the countries who have any kind of resources to compensate. So that's going to be an increasing problem. And the fact that the Glasgow summit didn't really make any progress on that, and the Glasgow summit, of course, did not recognize any of the negative contributions from China and Russia, primarily because I think most people, well, I know most people decided it was better not to confront those actors and waste time confronting them. So I think Margarita's points were absolutely right on. And I'll just close by making one observation. One of the activities of the Scotia Group was to involve a millennial generation people in the whole issue of climate change. And we had 4 different groups of millennials. And we just gave them a blank sheet of paper and said, you come up with whatever you think is the most important issue for the climate summit to address. And all 4 of those groups independently came up with the issue of damage and loss. So they have already skipped over the issue of reducing emissions, and they're so concerned about damage and loss. So I think that tells you something about the attitude of the millennial generation.
Thank you, John, for joining us today. We know you have to blast off to another appointment, and thanks again. So without further ado, I want to get to our next speaker. So there are over 1.2 billion people in the world who do not have access to electricity, most of them on the African continent. While there are many discussions at Glasgow about the Americas and Africa, it is not entirely clear how these important and very populous places will address climate change going forward. We are fortunate to have with us today Paul Isbell, our TLN fellow, and who I have come to know over the years as an expert on energy and energy issues in the Americas, particularly South America, and in Africa. Paul is an adjunct professor at the IE University School of Global and Public Affairs in Madrid. I hope I got that right. And at Suffolk University and he teaches global political economics, energy, and climate change. More recently, he has been the chief editor and senior writer of Global Alumni Education, a Spanish, European, and Latin American, a Spanish ed tech company in Madrid that creates online courses for US, European, and Latin American universities in digital transformation, business and finance, and sustainable development. Professor Isbell, welcome. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It's a pleasure to be here with my other accomplished panel mates. A pleasure to be here with you all, and a pleasure to be active with the network of the Transatlantic Leadership Network. And welcome to everyone who's online with us as well. I would agree with much that's been said by the ambassador and by our colleague, Dr. Asenova. I think before I begin, I'm just going to take the advantage to ask a question to clarify something that Margarita Asenova said about methane, the gas methane issue. Maybe I don't know if you want to leave it for later, or we can have a short exchange and then I can move on, however you want to do it. You're mute.
We're going to come back to methane again.
Okay.
We'll come back to methane again. So why don't you continue with your presentation, and
Sure.
then we'll get to Rudy, and then we'll come back to methane and the general questions.
Okay,
Thanks.
good. I understand your sequencing now. Okay. In that case, I understand my remit here to be to take a look at what's happened in the lead up to COP26 and what's come out of the Glasgow Climate Pact, and how it relates to both Latin America and Africa, and what are the disappointments and what are the potential opportunities that have actually come out of the Climate Pact for both continents in a large general sense, but recognizing certain amounts of variation at the sub-regional and national levels. To do this, I have prepared a PowerPoint presentation, more than anything, just to provide myself with some guiding notes and a few graphics, not very sophisticated, but allow me to share my screen for the remaining amount of my time with you. And I can give you my take on the African and Latin American perspective on the most recent climate summit. First, I'll give some general observations on the results, so to speak, and pick up a little bit with the previous comments. Then I will make an overview about some salient features about the energy and climate situations in both Latin America and the Caribbean and Africa in the lead up to COP26. I will lay out the main issues and priorities for both of these regions with respect to COP26 and its outcomes, and a few comments on some of the disappointments but opportunities that are real and are perceived by major actors in this Southern Atlantic area. So I guess I would have to say that, leading on from that comment, that I don't necessarily see COP26 as a failure or a complete failure. I suppose especially when I look at it from the angle of Latin America and Africa, where, things are already dire and all the countries are sort of handicapped in this whole effort to begin with. I see the glass more or less half full. For one thing, I think it's clear that even though we're not there yet, that since Copenhagen, there's been a steady increase in the pace of new commitments and new efforts, such that, assuming that all commitments, all NDCs, all midterm pledges and long-term strategies actually are implemented, we've pulled down the curve about 2 degrees. Obviously, it has to be filled in, but it's some kind of progress. It's a prerequisite, actually, for the rest. Also, you know, the oft-mentioned failure, and indeed the poor chap who ran the COP for the British had to include in the final text that the COP was extremely full of regret that this promise had not been met. The 100 billion a year to developing countries in finance by last year. And that's true, but it should be mentioned that you know, we're about 85% of the way there now, and that there is a new target that will have this met within 2 years, perhaps even faster. So while not enough, and the rate of progress must be ratcheted up significantly from now, I do think it's worth mentioning that it's not a complete failure. And indeed, we had the figure that was projected by the IEA in their most recent release yesterday, that actually shows if all the commitments are met, then we would be at 1.8 degrees Celsius, you know, in relation to the 1.5 degree goal. And that had come down by a few tenths of a degree from just last month. So there's been more commitments that have come in, more pledges in the last few weeks. And you can see here how, you know, we're not that far off this target of 100 billion. I mean, we have to relativize it a bit. Now, that's not the end of the story, nevertheless. Now, some of the positive highlights I see here, particularly in the vein of the Southern Atlantic. Now, while we can say that they are all incomplete, and there were several large coalition pledges, as we know, on deforestation, on international coal investment, and on methane. And we can discuss some of the relative, you know, teeth of these efforts, particularly methane, in light of the hole that's still in that coalition, which includes Russia and Iran. We can get into that a bit later. But I still think that that is part of the significant movement in the positive direction. Then I think in particular, the coalition that in part was led by the US and the EU that earmarked an additional $8.5 billion in climate finance to South Africa specifically to help phase out coal. Now, this I think is a very positive development because it shows the way forward where this kind of coalition can be duplicated in the Southern Atlantic for countries which, like South Africa is essentially as dependent on coal as any petrostate is on petroleum or gas. And there are a number of them, like Nigeria, Angola, Venezuela, and more, in this region across the Southern Atlantic that could use indeed this kind of climate finance that's directly earmarked for overcoming the high dependence on either one of the one or two or three of the fossil fuels. Another positive highlight from Glasgow, very, very, at least in the right direction for Africa and Latin America, is the call for a doubling of finance from among what's being channeled now, the 85 billion a year that we've gotten to the developed countries, to double the amount that's going to adaptation. And this, you know, even though in a minute we'll mention the disappointment of loss and damage not being experiencing a much greater leap forward in incorporating real loss and damage program into the Paris process, nevertheless, the movement towards adaptation goes in the right direction. Indeed, today, countries in the developing world are already themselves spending 10 times more in investment on adaptation than they're receiving yet from the only 20 to 30% of that 85 billion a year that are dedicated to adaptation. And then finally, something I'll return to more specifically later, another positive highlight, the resolution of Article 6 in the Paris Rule Book, which now frees the way for more international carbon trading. The disappointments, clearly the finance is still unresolved, the post-2025 finance, although There is a process in place and a timeline, and it's clear that the ambition will have to be larger. Already at the COP, different African and developing country coalitions were calling for from anywhere from 700 billion a year to 1.3 trillion to be institutionalized in that post 2025 timeframe. As we mentioned before, loss and damage has not been resolved, but again, at least glass half full, a process has been codified via the Santiago network to develop an acceptable plan over the next few years. And for me, and probably for many, I would say, African and Latin American countries, the fact that nature-based solutions was also not, raised up to a higher level of codification and inclusion was also a disappointment and left for the future. And essentially the oceans, the role that the oceans might gain as an anchor in the Paris Agreement process. There was a lot of ambition from large numbers of ocean and marine constituencies to see an ocean climate nexus built in as a sub-process within the Paris Agreement. It did not happen. There was a watered down mention of marine ecosystems. Nevertheless, those remain as relative disappointments for Latin America and Africa from the COP. Now, just to, since I know that time is flying away, and please don't feel that it's any bit of an aggression to cut me off, Deborah, at any time, because what I don't get to, I can bring in easily. But I do want to say that a few things on energy and a few things on land issues that distinguishes these two large regions from the rest of the world. These areas are not, not as dependent on fossil imports when we're thinking about energy, the energy geopolitics layout as the Northern Atlantic or Asia. Indeed, both continents are net exporters of energy at the large continental level. However, on the one hand, many of these national economies are highly dependent on fossil fuels in all ways, or in many ways: production, consumption, economic contribution, and budget contribution, and for exports. While at the same time, the other half or so of these countries are highly dependent on fossil fuel imports, and their matrices, their energy mixes, are also highly dependent on fossil fuels. Two other distinguishing characteristics which complicate the scenario. While in South America, there are large amounts of hydropower, indeed, South America, even all of Latin America, has in technical terms the cleanest regional energy mix because of hydropower. But at the same time, we all are aware that while on the one hand, neither Africa nor Latin America account for much of historic or current emissions, they're both 3 to 4% only, both are bearing the brunt of the impacts of climate change and all of that potential loss and damage to be addressed, as well as future adaptation needs. In addition, in Africa, and this was mentioned by Deborah Kagan in her introduction, there's a major problem with energy poverty, and there are 600 million without electricity. And in addition to that, the grids, the national grids in Africa in particular, are highly inadequate. And we'll return to that with the next round of questions and analysis. Then a very important issue to mention in the context, and this leads up to why there are some highlights and some opportunities, some bright lights for Africa and Latin America, the role of the so-called AFOLO sectors and AFOLO emissions, meaning emissions, sectors of activity and emissions from agriculture, forestry, and land use change in both continents or continental regions. And in this case, it's true whether we include Latin America, Mexico, or include it in North America. They're the largest source of emissions as a large category. And this places them in an anomaly with the other regions of the world where the AFOLO emissions are a minority, a distinct minority of emissions. Indeed, it's over half of emissions for both continents. These are being driven by deforestation and land degradation, in turn being driven by large agriculture and industry, but in many parts of these areas, also by poverty, which has been accelerated and exacerbated by climate change, with all of the climate refugees involved, particularly in Africa.
And Paul, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we're going to have to get to our next speaker. I apologize.
Okay, that's a shame, but no doubt I will come back to some of these points when we come back in the next round.
Yeah, and this is not going to be our only webinar, so
no, not at all.
We have to
Not
entice. We're going to entice people to come to our next one. But you've had a great lead-in to Dr. Baroudi. Especially, I'm starting to think we need to have a webinar just on water, just on the oceans, just on tidal and wave technologies, just on the kinetics of hydropower. So the Mediterranean is in many ways a microcosm of all that occurs globally, but on a broad regional scale. Dr. Rudy Baroudi is joining us from the region today. He's in Doha. He's one of the premier experts on the Mediterranean and is an accomplished author, including his upcoming landmark publication on blue economy in the Mediterranean, What the Blue Economy Means for a Greener Future, that will be published in December. Dr. Baroudi is the CEO of Energy and Environment Holding. He has 40 years of experience in this field, and we are just delighted to have him with us today. Dr. Baroudi, over to you. Please unmute.
Deborah, hi, and good morning, and thank you for the lovely introduction. At least I was very happy to listen to Paul Isabel, who has a more optimistic view of COP26, as some of the panelists were not very happy with what happened in Glasgow. As a Euromed observer and as a European one, I do believe that COP26 was at least more than successful by bringing in all of the world leaders and basically the G20, who were a few days prior to that in Rome. The most essential participant is definitely the US President Biden, who with a task like this needs a leadership. And as you probably know, the G20, they account for something like 75% of the world bad CO2 methane emission. So these G20, they were there and they committed to go basically after what was set in COP21 in Paris. As one of the keynote speaker in Glasgow, I think it was President der Leyen, that she said that the Paris was setting the stage. COP26 is the race is on. When you look at least the commitment for $100 billion per year for the next 5 to 10 to 15 years, this is going to be a great assistance to the developing world. As I can recall, in 1990, the solar panel per watt used to cost around $9 per watt. 30 years later, today, the same watt is around 0.35 cents. So what you can do with $100 billion in 1990 is much more than what you can do here now. On the wind farm too, like Paul has just mentioned, that the that the oceans were not explicitly included in COP26. The oceans, the sea, can also account for a lot of free energy for all. In 2008, the wind power used to cost per megawatt around million USD. Today is less than 900,000. So you can see the amount of savings in 10, 15, 20 years the technology brought to new energy tools for overall. All what I am trying to say is that Europe is trying to be the first ever continent free emissions by 2050. And by giving an example, I am sure the US is following, the South America is going to follow. The African continent, they have a lot of natural resources that they can do it on their own with a little bit of financing. The Sub-Sahara, for example, is as big as China. The Sub-Sahara region is as big as the US. The Sub-Sahara, if we use 15% of its sun, only 15% of its sun, it can give Europe 80% of the electricity that they need, except the cars, you know, household, industries, and. So all what I'm saying is that we can finance all of this with a little, as long as you have dialogue and cooperation. China is going to follow the coal. Australia, for example, they are big coal exporters, and they sit probably on the 5th or the 6th largest gas reserves. So which one is what? Now, coal is money maker and gas is money maker. But gas is money maker with much less CO2 emissions. So I do believe what Prime Minister Mario Draghi said, that it was a pretty successful one. I will not say that it failed. It did fantastic moves. It gave fantastic goals, but the money has to be spent in a nicer and more natural carbon emission way. So this is in a nutshell about what Glasgow has done, some achievements that is good to save our planet. And we have to let the policymakers to understand nature is us. Nature is our friend. Nature is not our enemy to fight it. We have to coexist with nature as 1,000 years ago or 100 years ago, our predecessor used to live with it. Nature is a friendly environment for us. Thank you.
Thank you, Rudy. Excellent presentation. We're running a little over, so what I'd like to do is to get to some questions that I've put down here, and I want to put one in terms of economics. And the baseline question I'm going to ask of all of our panelists is, how do you make climate goals, turning the world more green, more renewable, more economically palatable to countries that have been unwilling to go down this path? And what I mean by that is, in the United States, for example, a lot of states turned away from coal because it was no longer economically viable, and that included lawsuits for mine cave-ins, long-term health care, etc. And so the transition to gas was almost put in place because coal mining just became not as economically viable. And as we know, companies are more inclined to switch when they figure there's a better way to make money. So I just want to put that out there. In terms of how do we get from here to there, energy demand, of course, is rising as the economies recover from the global pandemic. This is boosting industrial activity and fueling concerns about inflation. Inflation in Europe and rising inflation in the United States are making people a little less willing to focus on the future as opposed to the immediate. And what I mean by that is, first, during high periods of inflation, it is less likely that governments can make the case for giving trillions of dollars to places in Africa and Latin America to promote these changes, because they want to get reelected, and domestic policies at home say, high inflation rates do not go well for elections. The second is the prices of energy now, because of the Russian squeeze, because of changes in the United States on pipelines, are causing pain at the pump and will cause anywhere between a 50 to a 400% rise in heating costs for this coming winter. So the broad question is, how then are governments supposed to proceed with their climate goals if the crisis of the moment always seems to take precedence over the crisis that climate change is going to be looking for, having for all of us? How then do you propose to change that dynamic so that this crisis of the moment, and it is a substantial crisis if you're spending 30% of your income on just filling up your car to get to your job, because not everyone has access to mass transit. Let's be honest here. So I'd like to get into a discussion about how do you make climate change more paramount when the crisis of the moment of high inflation and higher energy prices is seeming to take precedence once again. So I'm going to throw this open. Just raise your hand who wants to go first. I don't raise your hand virtually. Raise your hand so I can see it. Paul, is that you? Okay, Paul, why don't you go first? Turn off your mute button, please. Unmute.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you, Rudy, for your comments as well. I appreciated those. All right, well, your question that on inflation and on the sort of confluence in the popular imagination that maybe the current energy crisis in Europe, is directly related to trying to step up the transition. What I think there is that, oil prices have gone up and gas prices have gone up, particularly in Europe. So I think this pretty much circles the square of what was raised as an irony, if not a contradiction, that, while we're doing this heavy lifting globally in the international community to reduce emissions, at the same time, in the short term, because of a confluence of different developments that are coming together at this time, there's inflation problems, price problems, supply problems, and particularly in energy. That's why Biden, is calling for Saudi Arabia and to increase its oil production for right now. Of course, in the short run, it's a contradiction, but it allows for, that short-term problem, political problem, to be alleviated a bit. It makes sense. I should note, though, that on this short-term problem, because the electorate, is short-term, I think we're really beginning to see that to change in a lot of places. Because if the COP26 really showed one thing, that what started at the Paris COP, which was the real inclusion and enshrinement of the need for broad coalitions of non-party actors, meaning non-state actors and activists and different kinds of groups in civil society, they were enshrined even more in the Glasgow Climate Pact. And, they're out there in mass, the youth generation as activists, aligning with older generation activists, laying down the heat on all the actors who are custodians of emissions. So that's what I would say there. One last comment on the other question. I think what's needed, and COP26 pushed in this direction, you need market-based mechanisms for reducing emissions. You need them in most of the major emitters. And this means, either a tax, a carbon tax, or some kind of carbon market. And you need protocols, which are now freed for development by the agreement on Article 6 on international carbon trade by COP26. So you need that, but you also need this direct climate finance to get certain countries off the particular fossil fuel that, they have really no way on their own to get off, and certainly no incentives. So this direct approach with South Africa I think can be used in with other problematic fossil fuel dependent countries that have, either have little geopolitical and economic incentive to move, or simply feel that historically they shouldn't be they should be allowed to use a little bit of the carbon budget that's left. And this was one of the big disappointments of the Africa group, is that they wanted, they wanted much more out of the whole agreement, but at least they got some major movements on some of the issues, like this idea of a particular climate finance to help a fossil fuel dependent country, like Article 6 and a few of the other achievements.
Excellent. Thank you, Paul. Before I turn to others, I'm going to throw out one other question again because of our time constraints here, and ask for you to fold this in here as well. So the U.S. climate envoy, John Kerry, said, and I quote, that peer pressure and humiliation are key to holding countries accountable for climate pledges. Now, however, we all know there are countries who willfully evade their obligations at every opportunity, and they're unlikely, they have no embarrassment, no shame. And so the question that I'm going to throw out in the midst of all this as well is that, where do our panelists believe that will be the most convincing way to actually turn the words of COP26 into tangible and practical implementation, especially when countries like China and Russia, Iran, we've talked about this, are not likely to be shamed into doing the right thing? How do we turn that corner with these stubborn countries? And how do we, I just want to ask that our panelists incorporate this into the other questions that I've asked so we can have a little broader discussion here. And Margarita, do I see your hand here?
Yes.
Okay, please go ahead.
To answer the first question, how do we implement really tough reforms at the time of economic hardship, of financial hardship? Well, ask the Eastern Europeans. They have been in a situation to implement really tough reforms for the last 30 years under really hardship that was coming for economic development, delayed economic development, reforms that were delayed, and financial hardship. Inflation has always been high. Bank systems have collapsed several times in several countries. The question is, good reform policies, they have to be implemented together with good public policies. If a leadership does not have connection to the public to explain why these reforms are needed and what are the expected results, nothing is going to happen because people are not going to believe. We look at Poland and therapy that they went through back in the 90s. The public expected hardship and the public was looking forward to results. And the results came pretty quickly for Poland. Countries that were not able to back their reform policies with good public policy, they lagged behind because the public were pushing them and pulling them in different directions all the time. One example I would say is Bulgaria or Romania. So these are the two things that need to happen. The other thing that needs to happen is a lot of these changes can be made with no net cost. For example, Russia can curb its methane gas emissions, about 40% of them, they can be curbed with no extra cost. It's a question of, they say it's a question of plumbing to capture those methane emissions. And they're so dangerous that they have to be a way to force Russia into complying with simple measures to stop the leakages and to capture the methane gas emissions. And the only way to do that with Russia.
Margarita, let me interrupt you because I want to take what you just said. I think that's a really critical point. So can the Europeans force Russia and Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream to build pipelines that are less like Swiss cheese and stronger pipelines? Is there a way for Europe to do this I mean, we know that Russia thinks it has Europe over a barrel, but is there a way to get Russia over that proverbial barrel as well, so that that leakage stops? I'm just going to throw that into the mix here.
Well, there are two ways to do that. The carbon tax is one way. Diversification of gas supply is the other way.
Please continue with your other thought. I just wanted to ask you that particular
The
question.
diversification of gas supply, it's very important for Europe not to stop supporting projects that would allow the continent to receive alternative gas supplies. If you look at Azerbaijan, for example, that is started supplying Europe with some quantities, volumes of gas already, and look at their methane gas emissions, they are really in the low numbers. New technology, responsible building, Western investment in the new developments, Shah Deniz 1, Shah Deniz 2, and through the pipelines paid off. Russia, the building of Russian pipelines goes with corruption. I am not sure exactly what is the percentage that is designated to be given to different folks in the leadership from these projects, but that undermines the quality. And we see the methane emissions are high, partly because that there is no control. But if there is carbon tax that doesn't doesn't go to the customer to pay, but it's paid by Gazprom, then they'll start thinking twice, because it doesn't really cost that much to make those changes. But it's important that that a carbon tax is implemented, one, and two, it's very important European continent, European Union continues to look for other options like Azerbaijan to the Mediterranean, East Mediterranean for gas supplies, to develop other sources, because the experience with responsible producers such as Norway, such as the Netherlands, and now Azerbaijan shows that their methane gas emissions are very, very low.
Thank you, Margarita. And Rudy, I see you anxious to talk here. If you would unmute and pop into this conversation.
Well, Deborah, I can only endorse what our colleague Margarita said about the reforms. And one of the panelists, I think a keynote speaker in Glasgow, said the end is finance and the carbon tax. The carbon tax, once they price the carbon tax per ton, this is going to be a very much of a assistance to all the nations, whether it's China, Russia, Iran, to join in. The carbon tax, they have not established yet the dollar value per ton. Now, once they will have this, I think it's a very good motivator to bring all to the same table by 2030, 2040, and 2050. So I endorse what Margarita said, and we hope to have them all on board. Now, for financing, as you probably know, Africa, doesn't need much, as they have their own natural resources, but they need incentives, and the incentive is already there. In one of the seminars that I had last week, if 5 countries out of the G20, just 5, they take 1% of their defense budget per year, they can electrify all Africa. 1%. Less missiles or less bomb or less drones or less bullets or whatever you want. Just 1%. They can electrify all Africa and give Africa the basis to have the wind farms, the solar, for energy efficiency and energy cleanness. We need the cleanness. We have polluted this zone. Let's clear it up. Thanks.
Thanks, Rudy. I want to pose another question based on what you just said. I want to talk a little bit about there's a lot that is really possible right now in modern grid technology that would make electrification and cleaner electrification of Africa much more easy. Why was there not more talk at COP26 on the concept of grid technology, which I think is going to be instrumental in convincing a lot of countries that this is maybe easier now technologically than they thought it was. And also modern grid technology also has implications, not just, Paul, for the region of the world you've been discussing, but for Margarita on, disassociating parts of Eastern Europe from this old Soviet grid, which forces countries to rely on sources that are not reliable and not as clean. So, I thought, Rudy or Paul, if you want to comment on this and how modern advances in grid technology, instead of tying an entire country to a grid, how you tie 5,000 people as opposed to 2 million people, how you make it safer and more secure from everything from cyber attacks to physical attacks and weather, for example. How can that move this forward? I've always been very interested in this, and I of course want to hear your comments. Paul, do you want to take this?
Sure. That's a great question. It's a little bit of a different scenario on the two different continents. In Latin America, where energy poverty has been, reduced amongst all of the developing parts of the world, it's where it's the smallest. It's not the biggest issue. And indeed, there are, large national power grids all over the continent that go everywhere. And there's a certain amount, I would say more than anywhere else, except perhaps even more than in Europe, there's a large amount of energy integration. And so all the technologies for transmission technology are very important as Latin America, shifts to lower carbon, to renewables. So all the new generation regional transmission technology, system technology, electricity system technology, as well as interconnection technology between countries is very important. Now in Africa, it's a different situation because, Africa is based on the old traditional centralized national grid based on fossil fuels. It's a legacy of the industrial world's impact upon them. But their big problem is that, many states are underfunded. Most electrical companies are national or recently privatized. They're inefficient. Their grids are incomplete and faulty and do not reach the 600 million people. So in Africa, the new technology, which dovetails with their need to decarbonize, are microgrids and mini grids, and the potential of solar technology in particular to be distributed and decentralized. And a whole new raft of business models and activity is unfolding in Africa. Much more needs to be done. But the promise in Africa relies more on decentralization and a kind of leapfrogging of having to, under horrible conditions, try to finish out the completion of the old model, which is obsolete. And there's even to reach the Paris goals, there's a significant amount of stranded fossil fuel assets in both continents that will need to be absorbed and dealt with, as part of climate financing. And that's kind of the idea with the South Africa deal. Otherwise, on that point, the Africans, were at least willing to sign the agreement because they, even though it was posed by India, the idea of watering down the fossil fuel phase out to fossil fuel phase down. So more flexibility was allowed in that clause. And the African countries, basically, and this goes for some of the Latin American countries, to them, the choice now is either, look, you either allow us to have a slower phase down on fossil fuel, and consume more of what remains of the carbon budget and give us a bit of our, historical responsibility contribution from you that way, or you pony up like you did with South Africa, and you specifically target each of our major fossil fuel economies to convert over time and have that financing there. I see that as large potential. At this stage, if I could just address the methane question and ask a question of my own. I completely understand how Russia is clearly not cooperating and not doing what it could do on methane, irrespective of its geopolitical machinations. And as you mentioned, Margarita, I guess Russia is responsible right now for 20% of global methane emissions. And you said Iran also stayed out of the pact. But on the other hand, you said that if we did cut globally methane emissions by 30%, it would be equivalent to decarbonizing the transport sector or something like that, you said. Mm-hmm. So my question is, because I think, well, that's still a pretty good deal out of this coalition, because, how much is included by those that have signed on? Over half the methane emissions, I believe, are in that coalition. So I see that as a glass half full. And if we add to this, and I just want to ask you to probe this a bit, because you did say that it actually wouldn't cost Russia very much to eliminate these methane fugitive emissions from their pipeline system. So, it seems to me there's an opening with Russia somehow. If it's not that really difficult to do and not that cost ineffective for them, then there's got to be a solution there. I would guess.
I agree with you. They got to be a solution, but Gazprom is not even admitting what they have, what they release into the atmosphere. Russia, the International Energy Agency has calculated that the Russian global emissions are almost 15,000 kilotons. Gazprom admits to only 1,300 kilotons. So resolve the problem,
okay, well,
you have to recognize
no, there is a
the
transparency issue there, and I see how that weaves into Russia's sort of strategic view on how they're going to dance their way through all this climate stuff, at least for now. But another question, I don't know how relevant it is, but it occurred to me when we were talking about Russia's methane fugitive emissions, which are now coming from the pipeline system and from whatever gas flaring they still might be doing, I imagine. Well, that produces CO2 on the other hand. But as temperatures rise, and we expect one of the major tipping points to occur when the tundra's methane starts to be released, right? Now, I don't know if you have a reading on how much that's already occurring, but this problem, is there any solution? Because there does seem to be a solution to fugitive emissions from pipelines, but there doesn't seem to be a way to stop methane emissions from thawing tundra. So,
Paul,
this has got to affect the Russian calculus.
So, Paul, what I'd like to do is hold that thought here, because we're not going to have enough time to explore what happens from tundra in this particular webinar. But I do think Margarita already proposed a solution to cracking down on Russia, whether they admit to it, which is that if Europe starts placing a significant carbon tax on methane leaks, this may make Gazprom change their tune. I don't think they can do this right now, because from Russia's perspective, they have Europe over a barrel. Again, no pun intended. And they have the US over a barrel on this as well, since President Biden's gone to Russia to ask them to produce more. So I think in the longer run, maybe even 6 months from now or a year from now, that's an excellent idea. And I hope that the governments in Germany and France are listening to this, because that might be a way of making Russia do something that they don't want to put the energy into doing. No pun intended. Rudy, I'd like to turn back to you for a moment. because we've talked about oceans and water and the like and grid technology. There are some countries in the Mediterranean region who are now doing joint ventures with companies on, using tidal and wave technology to power port facilities and the like. And they're also looking at how to change that grid technology so that you can use this blue economy of the ocean to power not just a port facility, but how do you then transmit that energy that's going to power a port and maybe even a port city to get it more to a country's interior. And so I thought it'd be interesting for you to just give us a little tour d'horizon of some of your excellent ideas on that blue economy here, because we are running a little short on time. And I would like to put a teaser in there, not just for your upcoming book, but also for our future, and I'm thinking out loud here, and I don't know if Sasha's listening, but for our future webinars where we might just simply focus on using that blue economy and how do we combine that with smart grid technology so that we can actually transmit that power into interiors of people who are more landlocked. So Rudy, I'm going to ask you to just give us a little teaser here, if you would.
Sure. Deborah, first of all, the whole question of energy and environment, they are intertwined, they are all in the same basket, whether it's a CO2, whether it's a green, whether it's a pollution. Like in Europe, for example, there are 166 coal-fired power plants. 166. Out of them in the Euromed, you have around 52. So imagine 200 coal power plants transforming their fuel into gas. Now, Margarita says they both have CO2 and methane emission, yes, but technically, the natural gas pollutes 50% less than the coal. So this is number one, an achievement by the time we get into full green, whether it's solar or water or hydrokinetics or wind power and all. The Euromed already is interconnected from south to north to send gas and electricity from existing power plants from Algeria, Tunisia, Morocco, and Libya. So to add solar power plants in the sub-Sahara or in the north of the African continent is an easily target, and the lines are already there. The submarines is already analyzed, engineered, and can be connected and give plenty of power plant, not just for them themselves too, but for the north. Now, how easy it is, the dialogue, the ambitions of the nations. They need to sit down together and say, guys, we need to work together. Now, in COP26, all of the government of the G20 committed no more public funding to any coal power plants, period. No more power plants from public funds. And they have issued that the oil and gas companies will have limited licenses for another 1 or 2 years for exploration. So the end of existing oil and gas exploration is already there, but the new ones, it's going to be very tough to get it out. So this is also a major point to assist us in preserving the environment. Now, if in 20 years' time or in 30 years' time, things changed and we were able to keep the temperature at less than 1.5 or 2, then things could change. But at least we have to start with the clean wind, water, and whatever the nature gives us to use.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with this. What we have as a potential that's not well developed yet is biomass, energy from biomass, which we see it's a very, very tiny percentage in any renewable energy source in Europe, but it has incredible potential and not much dependence on the weather. One of the reasons for the European gas crisis this year was the fact that there was not much wind. And that's just a very small part of the reason. The other reason was that LNG was going mostly to Asia because the demand was high there. But the man-made reason for what we saw in Europe of incredibly high prices of $2,000 per 1,000 cubic meters was due to the reaction of the market to Russia stopping gas supplies to the continent. So there are two problems here: new energy sources, reliable gas suppliers that are not going to stage any kind of blackmails to their clients, and also for figuring out what are the base, as you said, what are the base energy sources for the energy transition. If it's gas, invest in making sure it's diversified. If it's nuclear power plants, invest in making sure they expand it or they're producing more nuclear power plants. Because new power plants, the new power plants to be built, it's going to take time. So what we have already done, maybe we can add a reactor here and there. Britain is talking about these mini reactors now that might be approved in the future. There were more innovative ways to produce energy that is not as dangerous for the environment. And hydrogen is also another one, but to produce hydrogen, you also have to use energy, right? So you have to have either gas or nuclear or renewable energy sources in order to produce more renewable energy sources. The bottom line is to figure out what our base energies and how we're going to implement them, and look into the coal production and coal usage, because you look at the Balkans, 50% of energy is still coming from coal. And it's a very big percentage, especially in the Western Balkans, that needs to be changed. And they're still building new power plants that are coal power plants, which is undermining the entire European agenda for climate change.
So I'll just, I'm going to take the priority of moderator to have the final word here. First, I want to thank all of our panelists. This is great. And I think we need to do more of these where we have this conversation part of this, because I'd like to see debate and argument and come up with great solutions, which I think we've discussed today. So I'm very pleased. As someone once said, you need a source of energy, so renewable energy, so if the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, you don't have people suffering blackouts, because it's not the 19th century. And we just have to look no further than California for an example of what happened when the gas plants were taken offline prematurely, and then the renewables did not provide what they needed. So, and this is some of what Europe might suffer this winter. So I think the way to get your populations behind this is to ensure that you have a constant flow here through, as someone once said to me, the oceans, unlike wind and sun, never stop moving. So that's why they provide something that others don't. I want to thank everyone for participating today. I want to thank our audience, and I apologize if there were questions and we didn't get to them. But these are very interesting topics, and we will be having more upcoming webinars, and we will gear them more specifically. We'll have many of you back again because you're so good as panelists. And I want to thank you all and wish you a great week. Thanks again, everyone. Goodbye.